So I have here with me today Nicholas Whitaker, and he's an expert for high achievers looking to navigate stress, burnout, and big life changes. And I know that you are a many talented individual. What else do you do? How did you get into this whole corporate education wellness space?
Yeah, well, first of all, Alan, it's good to see you, and thank you for reading my very overly long bio. Actually, hearing it read out loud always makes me realize I need to cut it down even further. But I do have a lot of different things that I have my fingers in. I think for me, a lot of this came from my own mental health journey, working in these different, very high stress environments for like several decades, and just noticing what was working, what wasn't. Where there was gaps in my own well being, my own experience, and then actively seeking out training, actually, finding learning and development opportunities as a lifelong learner to build my skill sets. Because I realized like the soft skills, communication skills, emotional regulation, emotional awareness skills, like these were the core things that were really holding me back as an earlier version of myself when I didn't have very high level skill sets in these areas. So doubling down on those, building out a collection of different things that really worked well for me. And then it made me realize like I actually really have a lot to offer to other folks to help them along their path, and mentorship and training and education is a big part of like what lights me up. So I kind of spent the last 8 or 9 years both working on myself very extensively, but also like building my skill sets as a facilitator and a teacher to help bring people along with me.
That's amazing. And of course, you and I worked together at Google for many years.
Yeah.
What got you into Google to begin with? What bridge led you there? It's kind of an unusual career path in
Yeah,
general.
it's very unusual. Yeah, because I mean, going back, and I was at Google a total of 13 years when you kind of count full time plus what they call TVCs, temps, vendors, contractors. So I spent a long time, most of my 30s and half of my 40s in there. And then before that, I had my own production company. So I was doing media, marketing, content, training videos, instructional videos, and things like that. This is kind of pre social media days. So working for nonprofits, government agencies, things like that. Some big names, and they're doing a bunch of work in reality television, the media industry writ large in New York City. And this is right around the 2008, 2010 economic collapse. So
Sure.
my business went from making six figures to making like no figures within a period of like a few months.
Oh,
And
wow.
it's very clear that like this was not a sustainable path, at least with what I had at that time in terms of skills, network, and just general availability. So I was getting drinks with a buddy of mine actually on the roof of his building, and he was like, "Hey, do you know anybody? Do you know any of your students?" I was teaching at the time video production. He's like, "Do you know any of
Nice.
your students that might be interested in doing some training videos for Google?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I'd love to. That'd be great." So I did like one or two introductory videos and some workshops for Google Earth and Google Maps, specifically trying to help news broadcasters use these. We called it the googly swoop, like coming down from
Yeah.
the sky down into like an urban area, googly swoop. Teaching them how to
GM.
actually do that. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, teach them how to use those tools, and then that kind of one thing led to another. I expanded the work that I was doing as a temp vendor and contractor, and eventually got hired full time to do that type of work for a team called the Google News Lab.
Yeah, that's really cool. I've known you for a while. I didn't know that whole story, so it's
Yeah.
good to have the elaboration. But so like that really connects back in with the whole big life changes thing. Were there other big changes that came in during that time period that kind of like led you down this wellness path?
Absolutely. Well, I mean, the biggest thing was hitting burnout for the first time.
Mm,
I never experienced burnout before. There wasn't even a word for burnout back then. People just didn't even talk about mental health issues in the workplace. It was just still very much, and it is still very much a taboo subject. I was in a very unique role. I was traveling internationally, representing Google in front of newsrooms at conferences and conventions, basically setting up train the trainer networks. I was in 32 countries in a period of 4 years. So it was essentially
wow.
like 2 to 3 weeks out of every month, I was on the road, airport, hotel, conference room, and rinse and repeat. And I had never experienced that type of frenetic energy and pressure and intensity of being in front of, you know, largely hostile audiences. They weren't particularly favorable to Google back then.
Sure.
Um, and it broke me, honestly. Like I was in Japan. I ended up on the floor of my hotel room, convinced I was having a heart attack. Uh,
Wow.
did some quick searching on YouTube, as everyone does when they're having a heart attack, to kind of see what's going on, and came across a Pema Chodron. Actually, she's a nun and a Buddhist monk, I believe, but she had this video basically on when things fall apart, which is her book, and it was a promo video for this book. And I came across that, and it reminded me, like, I had done meditation and mindfulness as like a younger person, but I never really took it seriously. It was only ever something that I kind of really did whenever I was in like crisis. Um, and it wasn't really like something that I put into my well-being toolkit on a regular basis. So watched a couple of these videos, managed to calm myself down a little bit, realized I wasn't actually having a heart attack at all. It just felt like that.
Thank
And then
goodness.
yeah, when I got back to the States, it was like something has to change.
Yeah.
So got a good therapist, had a good coach, started going more regularly to meditation sessions at the Shambhala Center and the Zen Buddhist Center in Brooklyn and Manhattan.
Oh, great.
It's kind of the beginning of my, like, let me take this seriously journey.
Yeah, for sure. And I'm glad you're here. I'm glad you took those steps because that's like I've seen too many people burn out, and it can have like really bad health effects long term, especially in learning and design. A lot of people don't think about that as something that's high pressure, but when you're on a stage facilitating a lot, like it definitely takes its toll, especially if it's boom, 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 right?
Yeah. And I don't think people really take that into account a lot of times, is that, burnout shows up in a lot of different ways for different people. But a lot of times it's either environmental or it's situational, so the type of energy you're putting out there, the type of work that you're doing, the type of culture and the colleagues that you're working with can really impact these things. Um, and there are basic things that you can do to take good care of yourself so that you're running that marathon as a marathon and not as a sprint, like as a lot of
Right.
people often use as an analogy or a
Love it.
metaphor.
Yeah, I've ran a marathon before. I barely ran it as a marathon, to be perfectly frank.
As long as you don't get
Um,
picked up by the sweep truck, that's always my goal.
right, yeah, just keep going, just a little bit ahead of it, right?
Yeah.
So I'm really curious about your time in learning and development and how you've used that with wellness. Tell me, like, I'm really curious about like the actual work you do. What is the project that you've done in that space that you're most proud of?
Yeah. In terms of learning development, I mean,
Yeah, learning development and like wellness. I feel like the
yeah.
two have kind of like combined in a really cool way
Yeah, they
for
really
you.
have. So I think, there's two things that come to mind. The first thing is really some of the work that I was doing for the Google News Lab back in the day. And it was really working with a community of people, journalists who are trying to bridge that digital divide, to basically bring their skills up to speed to the modern era as quickly as possible. And there's a lot of resistance there. There's a lot of like, I'm not good with technology there. There's a lot of just suspicion about, what was going on in the space, and building out this train the trainer model where we were essentially finding folks within region that knew the culture, they knew the intricacies of how those news ecosystems worked. They knew the learning needs of those organizations very well. We basically found those folks, trained them up on the skills that we were offering, and then allowed them to then go and off and train others. And it was like the first opportunity that I really had to work on a project that had like really big impact and scale. Before
Yeah,
that, I had been doing like one-on-one type of engagements or interventions, or I was doing group workshops or boot camps, but this was something that really had like massive impact, and we were able to hit like multiple thousands of people over the 4 or 5 years that we were doing that stuff. And it kind of was what was the precursor to even larger programs that I ended up participating in later on. So that's one that definitely comes to mind. More on the well-being front, I think the thing that I was really most proud of was the work that I was doing with the GPAUSE org within Google. So that was a meditation and mindfulness community, and it had this
yeah,
really interesting intersection of community development and community building, marketing, partnerships, because you're working with other affinity groups and other organizations within the company. And then also the direct taking people on a journey of discovery and self-awareness component. So it was this really fun activity that I was able to do to kind of pull all these various different elements of my education and background together to really serve a purpose and serve a need. Unfortunately, it was always just the 20% project that I was doing. It was
right.
never my full-time role, but that also I think gave me a lot of leeway to experiment and work with new ways of approaching it that had less pressure involved in it. So it had a
Yeah.
little bit of everything that I needed right then.
And for the non-Googlers listening to this, what's a 20% project?
Yeah, it's a myth, is what it is. A
Ah,
20% project is essentially, presumably, the ability for an individual that works at Google to take 20% of their time and devote it to another non-direct core role type of a job or volunteer effort or something along those lines. What it
yeah.
often ends up being is more like 120%. You're essentially doing it on your off hours on the weekends and things like that. But for me, it was a real passion project, and it was something that even to this day, since I've gotten laid off from Google most recently, the things that people have been reaching out to me about, it was never, hey, that executive deck that you put together was just like amazing, unforgettable. It was never like, hey, that spreadsheet that you sent was like really crisp and awesome. I think about that all the time. It was people reaching out about the GPAWS work, and it was about the meditation community that we built there and how it helped people in particular throughout the pandemic to weather some of these really difficult challenges that we've all been facing.
Yeah, I definitely took advantage of GPAWS myself. Recommend a friend. It was definitely very transformational for me at work. I'm curious on that. So like earlier you mentioned impact with the other project. How did you like, I'm super curious, how did you think in terms of impact for GPAWS, or was it not about that? Was it more about putting it out there? Like I don't want to put more words in your mouth, but tell
Yeah,
me
no,
about
it was a yes and. I mean, I think here's the thing with programs like this, like the ROI is so hard to measure, because you could get down to the point where you're saying like, okay, this individual took part in 2 workshops and 4 guided meditations, and because of that, their productivity and their execution and focus improved X%. Theoretically, you could do that, but there's so many other variables and factors that are coming into the mix. It's really hard to be able to get it down and say like this particular intervention really helped or supported. So the way we really measured success was more about reach and scale.
that.
you
Okay.
know Once we launched the newsletter, we had a speaker series where I brought experts and wisdom practitioners in from outside of Google into the community. We had at one point mini meditation retreats. We had daily meditations set up in multiple different time zones. And very quickly, we were able to see how that entire program expanded and scaled internationally to different markets. And we saw over time the uptick or the swell of people attending those, particularly during the first couple of years of COVID.
Yeah.
Um, and then we would have, CSAT surveys or customer satisfaction surveys and other types of feedback that we were able to get from folks on individual sessions that we did or workshops that we did, as well as the newsletter. So it's kind of this mix of customer experience, the scale and breadth of how that program expanded over time. And then I think the knock-on effect too is like we started getting a lot of positive feedback from leadership within various different organizations who were reaching
Oh,
out to
cool.
us because they heard about, hey, we knew that you did this mindfulness exercise or this mindfulness workshop for this team. Could you come in and do something like that for our team over here? So that was some of the things that we started to see over the last couple of years, was a lot more people coming to us. And that was a good indication. I was like, well, we must be doing something right here.
Yeah, well, that's a huge impact that you can see that, like especially with individuals coming back to you. Like it's you don't need to necessarily measure or refer to friend if the referrals are coming your way.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, that's great. I'm glad that went well. As far as the project goes, that's something that's very unusual inside of the corporate world. Like never before in my career have I seen anything quite like it. So it's amazing that you were able to be a part of it. But
Yeah, I mean, I'm honestly, it's one of the things I'm most grateful for in my time at Google. And it's birthed a lot of really interesting kind of side projects. I'm part of a group called the Mindful Workplace Alliance. It's folks
cool.
like myself who used to manage or currently manage well-being or mindfulness programs in their organizations. So it's a knowledge share and kind of like a brain trust of different folks that are trying to do this type of work in the space. There's another organization that I just recently joined up with called the Changing Work, hashtag Changing Work. Scott Shute, who was the former head of mindfulness and well-being programs at LinkedIn, as well as a bunch of other folks similar to us, we're working to kind of build a rubric and a model to go into organizations and kind of provide these same types of opportunities. Even for groups that maybe don't have that inherently built in. So how do we scale that? How do we set that up for them? And how do we provide those types of services? So, it gave me a good thing to pivot to as soon as the layoffs happened, as soon as I left Google.
That's great. I've loved to watch you on LinkedIn and whatnot, expanding that network. It's really cool.
Thanks, man. Appreciate
Uh,
it.
Have you ever been asked to create or deliver bad training?
I don't think they were ever asking me to create bad training, but they were often asking me to create training initiatives that were obviously not going to work for a variety of reasons. I had clients that would say like, yeah, we want, a keynote presentation and a fireside chat with our CEO. And then what we want to do is we want to have like some like direct engagements for individuals in these teams. And we're going to do that in like 2 weeks, and we're going to do it with no budget. And we don't know exactly what the outcomes are going to be. And like, no one's actually asked for any of this. So like, can you do that for us? And it's like, yeah, we technically could do that for you, but like, what are you actually trying to do? Like, what's the end goal that you're trying to achieve? What are the learning outcomes that you're hoping to take away from this experience? And is it meeting people where they're at within the areas where they're actually struggling? And I think one of the things that I notice a lot is like leaders feel that helicoptering somebody in and doing a workshop on well-being and mindfulness will just instantly solve their well-being and mindfulness issues.
Magic.
Magic. And then they wonder why people's like well-being scores are still declining and why people are still taking a lot of mental health leave and things like that. So, I think the trend that I saw over the last many years was like the perspective of some leaders was really taking a look at this as like a band-aid to what was really more of a structural or a systemic issue that needed to be addressed and solved. And what I would have loved to have been doing more for Google versus some of the companies, the startups that I was advising, was to have groups or companies or teams bring me in to assess those core root issues. Is it a communication issue with leadership? Is it the way that leadership is actually like embodying certain values that then trickle down from the top? How willing are they to actually make change happen? Is that something
Yeah.
that they actually care about? Those are the things that I really wanted to get my feet more embedded into. And that's obviously like now what I'm doing now that I've left Google is have been really be able to focus more on those type of things. That I think really creates lasting impact and creates the environments where learning can even happen in the first place.
Oh, that's fantastic. I started on a really negative note, and you really brought it to a very positive place. I love that. So I like checking on time here. I see we have about like 10 minutes left in our meeting. To wrap up, I'm curious, what do you see in the next 3 to 5 years? And I mean that coming from a L&D standpoint, but also from a wellness standpoint. I feel like we're just at the beginning of this really interesting wellness revolution in the workplace, coming at it from a training standpoint. Where do you see things going?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm super excited. There's never, I hate it when people say this, but I'm going to say it anyway. It's like there's never been a better time to be in learning and development and to be in these spaces and be talking about well-being and things like mindfulness. When I started out doing the work that I was doing before Google, we didn't have Twitter, we didn't have Instagram or Facebook or TikTok or any of these other channels. We didn't have the LMS systems that were available now. The technology just wasn't there. And with the advent of AI and some of these other technologies that have come out, I just think in general, it's incredibly way easier for somebody to get into learning and development, to create really well-crafted pieces of content that can be delivered in the ways that users need them to be delivered. There's a handful of companies that I've been working with more recently, experimenting with like text messaging as a modality for learning journeys or for mindfulness journeys. And in the case of the type of work that I'm doing,
Oh, great.
I've been talking with another company that's been messing around with a VR and AR as a learning modality and has done some really amazing stuff in the well-being space with veterans and other types of folks on the front lines who have been really impacted in traumatic ways by the work that they're doing. So, for me, it's a little bit still the Wild West, and I think that there's a lot of things that a lot of bells and whistles that are being put out there. But also, I think we've got like 50 some years now of like really solid research and study on what works in terms of moving people forward in a learning journey and how adults learn. A lot of the myths have been busted. A lot of like the bad advice has been moved past. So, what I'm really excited about is, maybe the way to say it is like the democratization of these tools and resources and the more ubiquitous nature of knowing how people learn and knowing what really works for folks, and a desire as well. I notice, just a lot of the younger generations, and even myself, like I'm a cuspy Gen X, but I think even myself, like I hunger for learning opportunities, and now there's so many options available out there. If anything, I think the thing that is going to be the detriment or a challenge is there is too many solutions that are out there now. So knowing how to focus your attention and knowing which ones to pick can be a challenge.
Yeah, no doubt. I've definitely noticed that, like both internal to companies, like company like obviously Google we just worked for, there's so many different learning
Yeah, how many
solutions.
LMSs do we have? Like 20?
Oh my God. It's so many. And also externally, like I've got LinkedIn Learning, I've got Master Class. I've got like all the different MOOCs that were out there for a while,
Yeah.
the massive open online courses, like go take a course from Harvard. Why not? It's almost it's just like an amazing age to live in, but it's also highly saturated. I'm curious, like based on that idea, there's all this information out there, there's all this content. What do you see as the future for L&D as a profession? Like obviously the elephant in the room is there's chat GPT, AI
Yeah.
creating training could be in the future.
Yeah.
What would the future look like with that in mind? Like is L&D dead? What would the future look like?
Yeah, well, me, the perennial optimist, I think with all these tools, like the information wants to be free. And I believe in that strongly. And I think that because of the fact that there's so many more channels for people to receive information, I think there's more opportunity for the right information to reach people at the right time. I mean, I just look at things like TikTok, for example, which, by the way, I'm not on TikTok personally, but you know,
Same.
I, I think there's some really amazing things happening in the learning space there. So much of the content that really works well there, and even beyond TikTok, you think about Instagram, you think about LinkedIn, you think about email newsletters, like education is what really converts people, giving,
Yeah.
offering. And I think atomizing that down into formats where people actually want to receive it, having it across a multitude of different channels and platforms, I think that's going to be the name of the game moving forward. And I think part of it too, getting really much closer to where the challenge is actually occurring, and getting the intervention into the person's experience where that challenge is actually happening. So you look at something like the well-being platform space, things like BetterUp, TaskHuman, these other services, like you can immediately have access to a therapist or a coach. Like when in history have we ever had that
Right.
opportunity?
I love
So
that you brought that up too, because like it's that sort of social emotional side of things, and that's learning too, right? Like you need that degree of motivation to kind of get you to learn the next thing, whether it's like a cognitive behavioral therapy with a
yeah,
psychotherapist or something. Anyway,
yeah.
apologies for interrupting. Please continue.
Yeah,
I
no,
just
no.
was so
It's all
excited.
about those little dopamine hits, man. No, it's true, So, how are we incentivizing people? And I think first and foremost, younger generations, and I would include myself into those, I think know that there is cheap or free learning that's available out there. And I think that's where a lot of them will start. They'll start with YouTube, they'll start with Reddit, they'll start with like WebMD or whatever it is, and they'll get
Yeah,
the bare bones there. And I think now that we have things like ChatGPT and like other AI tools that are essentially aggregators. What it basically
right.
provides is an amazing resource for somebody that has maybe a layman's level of understanding of a topic. Throw a couple keywords in there and get mostly factual information back. In the future, it'll be more factual, but I
Yeah,
think that it will help people learn more quickly. And I think for myself, I think of somebody who can't afford college, can't afford to go to a tech school, maybe has some sort of barrier to learning that's more environmental, but they've got an internet connection and they've got the ability to ask a question to Google or to ChatGPT or to Bing or something like that. That I think is going to radically shift what learning means. And it's going to change, I think, the level of quality that practitioners like myself then bring to the table, because we know that you can get a whole lot of basic stuff available for free. Now, what we can do is we can offer higher quality, more impactful work in ways that actually move the needle for folks. And I think that's really exciting.
I love that. Well, again, you brought us back to a very positive place on that, so I really appreciate it. And I'm humbled that you took your time with me today. I really appreciate you chatting with me. I owe you a coffee. Every day you're an inspiration to me. So thanks for hanging out.
Yeah, and thank you, Alan. I've been following your newsletter for ages and ages, and I've learned a ton, even just over the last couple of years. But also, I'm just super excited we're neighbors and we can grab an actual coffee in person these days. So, thank you.
Heck yeah.